You might have heard of their names.
My name's Corey Nathan.
My name is Simone Leeper. You might find their voices familiar.
Our idea is to provide and to share our original analysis on elections, on politics, and more broadly about strengthening democracy in an audio format so that we can engage with the general public, also with members of the media.
8 years and 800 some episodes later, here we are.
So who are the people behind your favorite podcast? Welcome to Meet the Host, a Q&A series that features the voices shaping our democratic discourse. Join us as we sit down with the brilliant hosts from the Democracy Group Network and get to know behind-the-scenes anecdotes of your favorite shows. Welcome to Meet the Host. I'm Jessie Wen. I'm super excited to bring you a collection of Meet the Host stories in this episode, which all started with my conversation at the beginning of this year with Simone Leeper. Simone is a legal counsel on the Campaign Legal Center's redistricting team and host of the Campaign Legal Center produced podcast Democracy Decoded. Each season, the podcast delves into a different area of Campaign Legal Center's work, a different area where democracy is facing challenges.
The challenges that CLC has faced have been challenges that have been faced by people across the country. So there have been challenges of unfair maps being put in place, different voting systems of election that are unfair, and CLC has been able to tear down some of those systems and challenge them in places like North Dakota, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin, and more. So now that more Americans in those places have, more of an equal voice in our democracy. Our whole country also faced a challenge in 2021 on January 6th with a challenge really to the heart of our democracy, being able to elect our own president. And so last year, thanks in part to CLC's advocacy, there was a group of bipartisan lawmakers that came together to draft and pass into law the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022. That provided a much needed update to the original Electoral Count Act of 1887. So this is the act that provides the framework, the legal framework for casting and counting electoral college votes in presidential elections. And now the updates to that law make it much more difficult for Congress to subvert future presidential elections.
The first season of Democracy Decoded talks about public financing and campaign finance. The second season focuses on voting rights, and the latest season hones in on state and local issues in elections. Simone said she's super excited to introduce Season 4 of Democracy Decoded, which is coming out this fall.
The mission of Democracy Decoded is really about teaching people more about issues going on in their democracy that affect them, that they might not know about, or opportunities to create change, innovative ways that our democracy can be better and that everyday people can work to get our democracy to be better. So we're telling stories about everyday people who are changing their democracy, about people at Campaign Legal Center, my colleagues who are working hard in many different issue areas to create change. Democracy Decoded is the brainchild of many brilliant people at CLC. I just get the benefit of being a host and its voice.
From the Campaign Legal Center's base in Washington, D.C., we next travel to Florida, where Liz Joyner awaits at the Village Square. Liz is the founder and president of the Village Square, a nonpartisan public educational forum devoted to building civic trust between people who don't look or think alike in hometowns. The Village Square also produces its long-running podcast, the Village SquareCast, that talks about anything politics, religion, and race through hundreds of conversations with tens of thousands of people. These conversations take place in bars, churches, and even at tables in the middle of the street downtown Tallahassee.
We've been at what we do for now 18 years almost. So we were pretty early to the space. And I think at first we just saw something that we thought was a local need. And we know now it was kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Having been at what they do for so long, Liz said the transition to telling and publishing their stories in an audio format was a no-brainer when podcasting came along.
So we are definitely not podcast hosts first. We're community builders first. But we have long recorded our programs and had them up online. And so when podcasts came along, I'm a big podcast fan. If I am moving and not working, I'm almost always listening to a podcast. And I've learned so much from doing that, that when podcasts came along, it was pretty automatic for us to think, maybe it's time for us to just have a new market. So I have a lot of respect for the people who really understand the podcast world, I think better than we do, because it's kind of it's our sideline. And I want to say that actually we started podcasting during the pandemic, and then just loved it and decided that we wanted to keep on keeping on. And I am not the host, so we have better talent than me, better on-air talent than me. The host is Corey Nathan.
Corey Nathan is the voice behind Talkin Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, or TPNR. He's also the executive producer of the show. TPNR has been in a space for about 3 years since Corey started the podcast right before the 2020 election.
So we really love this space and passionate about doing this work and engaging others across our differences in our wonderful pluralistic societies. I've been really grateful and invigorated to see, especially the folks who've come on the program to talk about this stuff, to talk about important subjects, to talk about our democracy, to talk about, as the democracy group says, like what's wrong in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it.
Through TPNR, Corey seeks to explore the intersection of politics and religion, as both played a huge part in his upbringing. Corey said he grew up in a very observant Jewish household, but then became a Christian in his late 20s.
Obviously, I had to have these very hard conversations with my parents about why I went this other path of embracing Christianity. And the first 3 years, especially with my dad, it was very hard to have those conversations. There was a great deal of contentiousness and conflict. So I'll give my dad a lot of credit because he came to a conclusion very early on. No matter how much we fought about it, his relationship with me as his son was more important than any differences we had, even differences as profound as our heritage, our family's heritage. So that's one thing. But the other thing, when I became a Christian, I started going to church, and I came to this realization that a lot of my friends at church, people that I was in a Bible study with, they were much more passionate. They had much deeper convictions about political and social issues than they did about theological issues, which is what brought me to Christianity. And I had to sometimes have very hard conversations, whether it was friends from church or my kids went to a Christian school, friends that our kids were going to school together. When there were times when what I was studying in scripture did not align with some passionate views, passionate political positions that they held. And then things got really real.
Since the creation of TPNR, the emphasis on coming together across differences have become a central mission for the podcast in our network. With this in mind, host Mila Atmos created Future Hindsight almost 8 years ago to promote more civic engagement, especially at the local levels.
I started Future Hindsight after the 2016 election because I felt like the cure for the unhappiness of so many voters during the 2016 cycle was more civic engagement. And I had this hypothesis that if we had more people civically engaged, it would change our politics. We would be a different kind of people. And if we were all civically engaged, we would have a different kind of body politic. The other hypothesis I had was that there was a lot that everyday people can do between voting and running for office. A lot of people think that the next thing to do after voting is running for office, but very few people realistically are going to be running for office. I wanted to also explore what's possible between voting and running for office. And I discovered that indeed there is so much to do to be civically engaged.
Podcast wasn't a big part of Mila's upbringing, but politics was. That's what inspired her to first get involved in public service and second, learn and exercise her rights as an American citizen.
I would say that I came from a family that was deeply involved, committed to
public service. I'm originally from Indonesia, and so I have many families who are public servants. And I always believed that public life is something that's very important in your everyday life in a way that I think is maybe not so common in the US. I think a lot of people think that's outside of them, although of course they are part of it. And I wouldn't say that I was necessarily deeply involved in politics. It was not really a big part of my life in the US because I came here as a teenager and then I was here on a student visa for a long time. And being a person who was not a US citizen, I also often felt like US politics was not necessarily relevant to my life. But once I became a US citizen, I thought, I have to get in there. I discovered very quickly, and I think everybody discovered very quickly after the 2016 election, that really it matters if you're in it or not. I mean, I've always been a lifelong voter. My whole family are lifelong voters. And so at least there, I have always been attuned to at least that very basic type of civic participation.
A political scientist by training and a political science teacher by the day, Mike Baranowski is not your typical podcast host. In 2015, he was listening to a couple of different podcasts when he came to the realization that he could do better to include more views from both the left and the right. So he did with the Politics Guys, the longest running podcast with more than 800 episodes in the Democracy Group Network.
2015 were these sort of earlier days, and it was a very different world in podcasting. And I had just started listening to them a few years before. And so I had no idea what it involved or what it was. I just assumed how hard could it be? So if I knew then what I know now, I don't know if I would have jumped in, but ignorance sometimes is bliss. And so, no, it was just, I just thought it was something that I could offer because from teaching politics for so long, I felt that I had an ability both to communicate ideas and also to be able to listen and bring in other views and sort of try to find points of agreement and build from that, because it's what I've done in the classroom for so long. Because if a student has some crazy, bizarre, out there view, I wasn't just going to say, "Well, that's dumb," right? You look for that even if it's a kernel, there's almost always a kernel of something. You can say, "Well, okay, let's take a look at this part of it, and let's build from there." And I really believe there are very few ideas that are just so completely dumb or worthless that you can't find something, some sort of common ground, something to build from, to try to find some agreement. And that's what I try to bring to the podcast. And I think we've been, pretty successful at doing that.
I have to say, the Politics Guys host panel seems like one of the most ideologically diverse teams. It is a rotating team that includes 2 political scientists, 1 center-left, 1 evangelical libertarian, a left-wing law professor, a conservative practicing attorney, and a former Trump administration official. Mike said they're really big believers in the idea of viewpoint diversity, and that's what he wanted to bring onto the show.
I think more than anything else is to give people a sense that the other side, whoever the other side is, they aren't necessarily stupid and or evil. And I think oftentimes that's sort of the view that it's so easy to fall into. It's like, well, these people clearly are not arguing good faith, so they're bad or evil. They don't, whatever, they hate poor people or people of color or what have you. And more often than not, at least for most people, when you really talk to them, you find out that, well, that's either not the case or it's more complicated than that. And so I think it's just so important to have these conversations, to see that, and not just for us to model that, but for people to go out in their lives and have those conversations and not just be talking with people they already agree with. Because I think those are the easiest conversations to have, but I think oftentimes they're the least helpful, the least useful, the least kind of valuable conversations to have.
You can read the full Q&A with Democracy Decoded, Village SquareCast, TPNR, Future Hindsight, and the Politics Guys on our website. You can find a link in the show notes. I'm Jessie Wen. Thank you for listening.